My guest today is Dan LeRoy. Dan is an author, journalist, and teacher. His writing about music and politics has appeared in many major publications, including New York Times, Rolling Stone, Newsweek, The Village Voice, Alternative Press, Esquire, and the National Review. Today, we're going to discuss his new book, Lions Liberty. Hi, Dan. How are you doing today?
Jeff, how's it going? Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's certainly a pleasure and a privilege to join you today.
Well, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I really enjoyed your new book, Lions Liberty, and I was interested in how you became interested in the Catholic revolutionaries who established the United States.
I'm glad you asked that question because there are two answers. The first answer is that I was blessed to be part of a household where not only was literature a big part of it and was encouraged to be part of our lives, but also history. I grew up in a household where it was important to know history generally and then our own history, where the people in our family came from. My mom is a great genealogist, and she inculcated a love of history early on. So that's the first part of it. The second and more specific part, I'm also happy to say, happened while I was lucky enough to be sitting in the Perpetual Adoration Chapel at our church in here in Beaver County, St. Monica. And we are lucky to have a chapel in which I could sit and do some reading. And I was reading my copy of Magnificat, and there's a great monthly column by Anthony Esselin called How the Church Changed the World. And on this particular evening, the subject happened to be the Catholic and Polish revolutionary Kazimierz Pulaski. And I read this story, and they're always engaging. He's a great writer. And at the end of it, he mentioned something along the lines of, there were some other Catholics who were very instrumental in the cause for independence. And I went looking for the book to try to find out more, and there wasn't a book, so I decided I'd try to write it myself.
Mm-hmm. So you live in a part of the country that is really close to where a lot of this history actually happened.
Which, was very fortunate. You do have to drive across the turnpike to get to a lot of that stuff in Philadelphia and around New Jersey. But yeah, the whole state is really one of the two most significant colonies where Catholics really had some measure of religious liberty, because they didn't have it throughout most of the colonies during this time. But Pennsylvania was founded, like Maryland, at least on some principles of religious liberty. Old St. Joseph's and Old St. Mary's in Philadelphia were the only two places in the British Empire where you could attend a public mass during this time. And so, yeah, it's steeped in Catholic history, and I was very fortunate to be here and be that close to it while I was writing this book.
And who are some of the Catholics that were instrumental in early American history?
Well, it's a long list, and I think we could divide it into the colonial Catholics, and those would be people like Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who I think in a lot of ways, at least the book tries to make this argument, is really one of the intellectual founders of the revolution. He was a guy who recognized very early on, whereas fellow founders didn't, that there was no reconciliation possible with Great Britain, that the colonies had become their own nation and it was time for them to declare their independence. He figured this out in 10 years prior to the revolution. So Charles Carroll is one of those figures. His cousin John Carroll, who became later the first bishop, the first Catholic bishop in America, and later the first Catholic Archbishop of America. John Carroll's brother, Daniel Carroll, who played a small but pretty significant role in the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution's ratification. So you have figures like that. And then you also have, on the other side of things, the foreign Catholics, and they played a huge role, not just militarily, although certainly in that way, but also You have folks like Father Ferdinand Farmer and Father Pierre Gibault, who not only were traveling priests who kind of brought the faith to people during this time of persecution, during this time when you could not attend public masses, but at least in the case of Father Gibault in particular, played a military role as well in kind of helping win the Western frontier. And the West is really the part of colonial America that I think we just don't know enough about it, and it's certainly plays a big role in talking about the importance of Catholicism during this era, because we tend to look at things from a northeastern perspective, and it's understandable. That's where most of the big cities were. That's where a lot of the battles are fought. But on the western frontier, you have a very significant Catholic community in Spanish Louisiana, and you have the French influence all up and down the Mississippi. And had it not been for what happens on the western frontier, those big battles that we know well back east would not have gone the way they went, because those dominoes had to fall in the west for victory in the east to finally be possible. And that's in large part because of Catholic contributions.
And you go into all those stories in the book. So if somebody wants to really get in depth with this, go to the book. It's a lot of great stories, a lot of great history there. Dan, how were the early Catholics treated?
Well, the short answer there is not very well. And the thing about it is, compared to the persecution that Catholics faced in England, you could make the argument that colonists perhaps had it a little better. But in the big picture, if you look at the restrictions, no place where you can attend mass publicly, other than the couple of places that we just mentioned. You can't vote by and large. You cannot hold public office by and large. If you want your children to receive a Catholic education, you have to send them overseas. And not only do you put your perhaps 10 or 11-year-old kid on a ship where there's no guarantee that they're going to survive the crossing, no guarantee you're ever going to see them again, but you also have to pay, in a lot of cases, exorbitant taxes just for the privilege of getting to send them on this very dangerous journey. And it didn't matter if you had, as Charles Carroll of Carrollton did, maybe more money than anybody in the colonies. If he didn't have the most money, he was top 5 for sure. But it didn't matter. You were a second-class citizen all the way. And that, I think, is the biggest takeaway. Yes, in some cases, in some colonies like Maryland, Pennsylvania, there's a don't ask, don't tell policy. Listen, you guys do this stuff and don't let us hear about it, and we'll turn a blind eye. But in a lot of cases, that wasn't the case. If you go into New Jersey or New York, a priest in New York can be forcibly expelled, and the second time, you can be hanged. And it did happen. So uh, tolerance was really confined to Maryland and Pennsylvania. And even then, those Catholics certainly labored under a number of different oppressions. So religious liberty was more theoretical, even in Maryland, Pennsylvania, than it was an actual thing.
Mhm. You talk in the book a little bit about statues today being defaced and who those people were and the history there. What similarities do you see between the early American history and some of what we see today, Dan?
Here's a big similarity that didn't occur to me until I was pretty deep into the writing of this book last year when the pandemic hit. As you know, in a lot of places across America, in most places across America, churches are closed. You cannot attend Mass. If you're lucky, your parish does it through Facebook or some other social media means, but people went through an Easter season where they could not attend Mass. And a lot of the similarity kind of came in recognizing that, hey, this is actually what, under a very different set of circumstances, but this is actually what some of our colonial Catholic forebears had to contend with. They also didn't know when they were going to be able to attend Mass in person. Uh, they were also subject to the whims of the state when it came to when it is okay for you to worship and when it isn't. And while again, the circumstances here have to do with the pandemic rather than widespread religious persecution, it certainly gave me pause a number of times in writing this book and thinking about these stories about, you know, how how far off from this are we really? And certainly, I think we had to say the events of the last year. You know, I wouldn't say that they've trended in an encouraging direction as the pandemic has kind of wound down. I think we're still seeing a lot of these beliefs and actions still in place, and it's a lot harder to get rid of this stuff than what might first seem. So that's just one of the many parallels that I noticed between, you know, what happened during the colonial era and what happened as recently as now. And I always think, like, if you're going to sell a history book, the big thing that any student will tell you is, why do I have to learn this? Like, what does this have to do with me? There's a what it did have to do with me moment, just one of many.
Well, history does tend to repeat itself in different ways.
Absolutely. We can hope that we won't get to see some of the ways that it took place during this colonial era, but um, that is that's something I guess we're going to have to see develop.
Dan, what surprised you as you're doing the research for this book?
I think the two things that surprised me the most are, one, that while there were and are a lot of books, as you mentioned at the beginning, about Catholics and about this era, that there wasn't or had not been any attempt to try to put all of these stories under one cover.
Mhm.
And certainly don't mean for it to sound self-aggrandizing, but I think one of the reasons why these contributions have been underrated is simply that there isn't a kind of one-stop shop where you can go and find all of this stuff. So I was surprised by the lack of a book like this one. The other thing that I think is surprising is just remembering uh, the attitudes of a lot of the founders. And I suppose that I knew, for example, that John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, just to cite a couple of examples, I kind of knew these guys were not necessarily Catholic boosters. But it's still a little surprising to go back to the record and see some of the things that were written and said by these figures with reference to Catholics at the time. You know, the historical irony of Alexander Hamilton, who was an immigrant, saying after the Quebec Act is passed, and I paraphrase, but only just, doesn't make your blood run cold to imagine these armies of papists overrunning our country and all of these immigrants who are under the Pope's direction. I mean, coming from a guy who was himself an immigrant, that's a little on the rich side. But the flip side of that is, I think the Catholic and the American thing to do, especially since we're in the middle of this culture in which you can be canceled at a moment's notice. I think the thing for us to do is try to remember, okay, uh, these weren't very nice things that they said, but you know, as it says in the beginning of Liberty's Lands about Catholics and slavery, you know, the fact that some of these guys did own slaves, and it's a part of history that we can't look away from. It doesn't mean that they weren't great men. It means that they weren't as great as they could have and should have been, especially given what it says in the magisterium about owning slaves. So, you know, there are flaws there. There were flaws on the part of the founders when it came to dealing with Catholics. And I think the big mistake we would make is to, at this point, hold it against them. You know, some of these guys came around. John Adams, in his later years, was one of the contributors to building a Catholic church in Boston. So, and in the big picture, all of these founders, whatever their thoughts about Catholics were, Catholics were able to find their place in this country. Catholics made a leap of faith, and at least some of these people were able to meet them in making that leap of faith. It was Alexander Hamilton himself who said, uh, as the war reached its peak, oh God, the French and the Spanish are going to have to save us. And guess what? He was right. They did. And if they hadn't saved us, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. So practicality kind of ruled the day when it came to some of these attitudes. And I think we have to try to be charitable in our recollections of these guys. They were great in a lot of ways, maybe just not in that particular way.
Well, part of what we tend to do, or what secular culture tends to do, is take things out of context, put things from a historical standpoint and put it in today's standards, and it just doesn't fit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's one of the perpetual mistakes. It's a mistake we now see being made, on a daily, hourly basis. That was something I was determined that this book would not succumb to, because some people will try to tell you, hey, that's a dodge. Like, there's a right way and a wrong way to live, no matter what era you live in. And in some cases, you can make that argument. In the cases of some of the things that we're talking about here, I think that's a mistaken argument to make. And, where do you end up there? You end up as it was at the end of the French Revolution. Nobody left to behead.
Dan, what else would you like to share with the regular Catholic guys out there?
Well, as a guy who considers himself to be a regular Catholic guy, I would say that if you're looking for my book, the places where you can find it would be through the publisher, Sophia Institute, and that's sophiainstitute.com. You can find it at all the usual online outlets, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and the rest. And if you would like a personally signed copy, you can go to my website, which is Dan LeRoy, that's LEROY.com. And I'll be happy to sign one however you like it and ship it out to you. If you go to my website, you can also keep track of where there will be some appearances. And I'm hoping, COVID notwithstanding, I am hoping to be out there this summer and fall, making some appearances and talking about the book. You can also book an appearance there if you're also looking ahead to this time when we can actually get back together. Of course, Zoom works the same way, and that can work as well. But go to the website. You can sign up for updates, and I will be happy to keep you updated if you do. Regular Catholic guys, girls, whoever.
Thanks, Dan. We'll put all that in the show notes as well. Dan's website will be on there, and where you can get the book will be on there as well. Thank you, Dan, and God bless.
God bless you too. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me on as a guest. I really appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome.